Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, class. My name is Brian Jones, and this is my graduate research project titled Managing Generation Z Officers in Law Enforcement. This is for Management 5690.E1, Spring 2023. So, a brief overview of what we'll discuss today. We'll start off with the background on this topic, then we'll look at the introduction and hypothesis. We'll discuss the characteristics of Generation Z, the literature review, limitations of studies, some suggestions, the methodology. In conclusions, we'll look at the implications of 21st century workforce, and then we'll finish with the recommendations. So, quick background on this topic. I've been in the law enforcement field for the last 14 years, with the last 7 of those 14 years being a supervisor. Right now, many of you may know and some may not, the state of law enforcement is like a lot of other industries. We're losing people faster than we can hire new people. Due to high-profile events across the country, George Floyd being one of them, also the COVID-19 pandemic, law enforcement officers are leaving the field in droves. And every agency is having a hard time as far as recruiting enough officers to replace the ones that are leaving. The applicant pool has already shrunk in size, so agencies are having to get creative with how they recruit officers, and these new officers are coming in are Generation Z. So as you look at the generations in my agency, I work for a mid-sized police department in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We currently have 925 employees. Of those 925 employees, baby boomers represent 7%, Generation X represents 36%, the millennials represent 48%, and Generation Z is represented with 9%. Of course, as we continue on this trend, in the future you will see that Generation Z will start taking up a bigger percentage of the workforce, while the baby boomers will start being less as they enter retirement. Let's look at the introduction. So Generation Z, the birth years are from 1997 to 2012. They currently represent 24% of the U.S. population, and they are wedged in the middle of the millennial generation and the alpha generation. Research has shown that this will be the most racially and ethnically diverse generation we've had. Technology sophisticated. They are the first to grow up with smartphones and social media. And we'll see later how this impacts them in the workforce. And they're also on track to be the most educated generation. And what's interesting about Generation Z, they'll be the first generation to enter the workforce during a global pandemic. And be introduced to a hybrid work model of remote and in office. And they also have similar viewpoints to some of the major issues of millennials. And like I mentioned earlier, the majority of the new officers entering law enforcement belong to Generation Z. So if we look at Generation Z communication style, there's some things to consider. Generation Z has an informal, individual, and straight way of communicating in the workplace. They favor face-to-face communication. However, with them growing up with smartphones and social media, a lot of them are very comfortable with not having face-to-face communication while leveraging technology to communicate at work when it applies. Due to their heavy technological influence, they prefer social media, texting, and video conference versus emails and phone calls. And also growing up in a state where they're multitasking with their communication, Generation Z is very comfortable with having multiple conversations with multiple people at once. As far as communication as well, they want managers who will listen to their ideas and value their feelings. And they also have a shorter attention span compared to other generations. This is due to social media. If you look at, I know Vine was real popular right now. We have TikTok and Snapchat. Those apps are based on 6 to 20-second videos that capture your attention in a quick way and move on to the next. So we also see this in the workplace. So a few management tips and suggestions for Generation Z as it relates to communication style. Employers need to get to know their Generation Z employees on a personal level. Keep in mind these are broad characteristics for the whole generation. Every person in Generation Z may not fall into this category, but as management and leaders, knowing your employees on a personal level, you can figure out what communication style they prefer. And the technique I like to use is ask them. Ask them, how do you want to communicate? How do you like to receive communication? And how do you want me to communicate to you? Managers and leaders should also study the communication styles of Generation Z, as well as incorporate Generation Z's technology into the workplace communication. So next we'll take a look at Generation Z's work ethic. 32% believe they are the hardest working generation. However, 42% feel like college did not prepare them for the workplace. We've seen that Generation Z prefers to work as individuals and they like competition, and their work life is guided by, their work ethic is guided by a work-life balance. I know that's a buzzword in law enforcement, and I believe a lot of other industries right now is work-life balance. I believe this is due to Generation Z seeing their parents work hard, miss events and miss things. So now they're very keen on having a work-life balance, which shows up in the workplace in a lot of different areas in different ways. So managers must be able to understand that and just make sure that the work time of that work-life balance equation, they're getting quality work out of Generation Z employees. Some things that upset Generation Z workers is when they're asked to work when they don't want to, they're denied their annual leave, and when they're asked to do mandatory overtime. Here are some management tips and suggestions for Generation Z as it relates to their work ethic. First, like I said previously, managers and leaders should get to know the work ethic of your individual Generation Z employees. These characteristics are not a one-size-fits-all, so it's best to know your employees at a personal level, but also at a group level. And then managers and leaders must learn what motivates their Generation Z employees. And last, they should find creative ways to inspire competition. Some people feed off competition, others don't. But as a whole, this generation likes competition. So I think the managers and leaders who find creative ways to inspire their competition will increase their productivity and overall employee morale in their organization. As we look at Generation Z's performance feedback, a 2018 research study showed that 21% of them need feedback from their supervisor daily or several times each day. So I was looking at this study, it was very interesting, and I was kind of saying, why is this? And I believe that in the age of social media, Instagram, your Twitter, your Facebook, this generation is only known getting that constant, quick feedback. They post something, they can see who liked it, who viewed it, how many views did it get, and that's confirmation or affirmation a lot. So this bleeds over to the workplace the same way. They want that constant feedback, 21% of them do, from the supervisor daily or several times a day. 24% of Generation Z employees need feedback from the supervisor at least once a week, while 21% of Generation Z employees need feedback from the supervisor every few weeks. So a few management tips and suggestions for Generation Z performance feedback. As a manager and leader, you should have frequent communicative feedback that is transparent and direct communication with Generation Z employees. While you're having this feedback, you should advise Generation Z employees areas they need to focus on, how they can improve, and how they're doing. I always like to say a brief conversation once a week can be more valuable than a once a month hour meeting. The whole way of doing things is, okay, we're going to meet maybe biannually and talk about your performance, but keep in mind with this new generation, they need that constant feedback. How am I doing? What do I need to be doing better? They just want to know you care, but they're used to that based on being raised in the social media era. So when you look into Generation Z knowledge transfer, there's 4 key takeaways. How do you like to transfer knowledge? First, virtually. Next, technology-based. Next, easily and rapidly. And last, frequently. And I think as you see these 4 components, you can see how the technology and the social media heavily influence every aspect of this generation. And knowledge transfer is one of them. So as a manager and a leader, we must take this into consideration when we're trying to transfer knowledge to Generation Z in our organizations. So we look at some management tips and suggestions for Generation Z as it relates to knowledge transfer. First, managers should be efficient in technology used by Generation Z to accommodate knowledge transfer in their organization. So as a management and leader, we must continue to grow. And part of that continuing to grow is to be up on the latest technology, social media, especially if you have a lot of Generation Z employees in your industry or you're trying to recruit and retain them, you need to be able to speak their language, and that's one way to do it. Managers and leaders should be able to use Zoom and Teams for meetings or to transfer knowledge. One good idea that I found during the research is managers and leaders can create internal organization and podcasts. So podcasts are very, very popular right now with everyone, but especially Generation Z. And a 5 to 10 minute podcast about information that they need to know or should know, or new training that's coming out, can be very valuable to your Generation Z employees. Managers and leaders should create a culture of continuous learning, and also they should pair Generation Z employees with older employees. That way you can have great knowledge transfer from Generation Z up, but also from the older employees in different generations down. So we look at Generation Z and decision making. Several things that we focus on. So self-reflection, how they make their decisions, consultation with advisors they trust, online research, including social media, 81% of them use that, and personal connections. So Generation Z feelings about making decisions before they make decisions. 60% feel anxious, 59% feel nervous, and 51% feel overwhelmed. So some management tips and suggestions for Generation Z when it comes to decision making. Based on research, managers and leaders should give them adequate time to make a decision. They also need to be prepared to help and guide them if necessary, and they need to be flexible with them as far as using social media platforms to research issues before they make a decision. We live now in the YouTube era. I think a lot of people are starting to use YouTube more than Google when it comes to figuring stuff out, questions about decisions, or trying to learn how to do something. YouTube is a very valuable tool. So as management and leaders, you have to be flexible and allow them to use these things before they make a key or important decision in the workplace. Next, we'll take a look at my hypothesis for this research. Law enforcement managers and leaders fully understanding Generation Z will help them manage and lead them more effectively, which could increase the retention rate of Generation Z officers. So for the literature review, for this project, I reviewed approximately 13 peer-reviewed studies related to Generation Z in the workplace. The two I focused on mostly were called Hey Bosses, Here's What Generation Z Actually Wants at Work. And the next one was called Challenges Involving Generation Z Law Enforcement Officers. So in the first study, Hey Bosses, Here's What Generation Z Actually Wants at Work, the purpose was to determine the relationship Generation Z has with their bosses and also discover the challenges of those relationships and provide solutions. The methodology used was they performed a dozen qualitative interviews with Generation Z employees. Based on the themes from those interviews, 2,000 Generation Z employees and 600 bosses from all generations were surveyed. Limitations of this research: only 1,718 or 1,718 respondents out of 2,600 that were sent out. And as well as this is limited, there's limited, previous research on this topic. So these were some of the findings from this study. The 5 challenges between Generation Z and their bosses were different views on the importance of empathy, different views about the impact of mental health and how it impacts work and mental health, different views on the importance of personal identity to work, inadequate job readiness and training for success, and different views on recognition and reward structures. So when looking at empathy, 1 out of 3 Generation Z employees don't feel cared about for in the workplace. The studies have shown that those who feel cared for are 3.3 times more likely to come to work and less likely to leave their job. One major component of a Generation Z employee, I believe, is they want to know that you care. Right? They want to know that you care, and that's half the battle. As we look into mental health, nearly half of Generation Z employees said they're burned out from the workload. Less than half said their boss helps maintain a healthy workload. 28% said they struggle with mental health because of their bosses. And if we look at the work identity, 61% feel like their work is a major part of their identity, while 86% of the bosses say that their work is a major part of their identity. So we see that generational difference of Generational Z are not being identified solely based on what they do for a living. They want a deeper meaning. So it's job readiness and training for success. Only half feel like they've been trained for success. Generation Z employees who believe they are being taught the proper skills to be successful are 2.5 times more likely to stay at an organization. And lastly, for the recognition and reward structures, Generation Z stated that time off was the #1 way they wanted to be recognized. As it relates to their bosses, time off was the 12th way they wanted to be recognized. So we can see that there is definitely a gap as far as the belief of Generation Z and their bosses. So the 5 challenges listed above created the following gaps. First, knowledge gap. Bosses agree that change is necessary, however, they don't fully understand what Generation Z wants. Next was an alignment gap. Bosses know what Generation Z wants, but they don't believe change is necessary. And last was the execution gap, where both parties agree that change is necessary, but the bosses cannot deliver on the desired changes. So some suggestions that came out of this study. was managers and leaders should get curious. Get curious about Generation Z, how they are, how they learn, how they work. They should connect. I always like to say you have to have a relationship with your employees before you can lead them. So they must connect with Generation Z employees and also be able to co-create. This generation has a lot to bring to the workplace. They have a lot of value based on how they were raised and things they've been through in the generation. Use that, leverage that to co-create things in your organization. Next, create a culture of reverse mentoring. A lot of times, Generation Z is going to be your SMEs, subject matter experts on most technical and social media issues in the workplace. Leverage that, use that, help them to have their influence by mentoring your older generations. And that will help the older generation understand Generation Z better. And last, ask the influencers. So within your organization, you always have influencers, and within generations, you'll have influencers. Ask those Generation Z influencers within your organization, hey, where we're missing the ball at? Where can we be better? How can we incorporate you more? So the next study was challenges involving Generation Z law enforcement officers. The purpose of this study was to provide law enforcement agencies with information on how to properly manage and train Generation Z officers. The methodology used is surveyed multiple Florida law enforcement agencies to determine the challenges they were facing with their Generation Z officers, and they also surveyed Generation Z officers. Also used 8 questions. The agencies were asked to provide information on how they were dealing with these issues. The limitation of the study, only 25% response rate to the survey, non-responses from 36 surveys that were sent out, and also some respondents skipped questions. So we look at the findings of this study. The issues encountered dealing with Generation Z officers, 7 listed a lack of life experience, 4 maturity, 4 listed electronic dependency, 4 listed verbal communication, 3 listed written communication, 3 listed time management issues, 2 for laziness, 2 for decision-making issues, 2 for complaints continually, 1 for attention issues, 1 for location, direction issues, and then 1 for tardiness. Some more findings in this study. 4 agencies representatives advised that training and managing methods for Generation Z should change. 5 agency representatives advised that training management methods should not change for Generation Z. And the top skills that Generation Z brings to law enforcement that were found in this study were technology savvy, think outside the box, blame deflection, and good multitaskers. And also the order of importance to Generation Z: officers of salary, specialized unit, obtaining rank, and retirement. So some suggestions. Managers should know and understand the generational difference between Generation Z and the older generations. Managers will have to be flexible and willing to change how they manage Generation Z officers. Next, agencies should incorporate interactive and virtual trainings for Generation Z officers. And managers should provide immediate feedback to Generation Z officers. I believe if the agencies that do these things, they will be highly successful in first recruiting Generation Z officers and retaining Generation Z officers. The agencies that want to hold on to their old ways and not change, those are the agencies we'll see where their recruiting and hiring numbers will fall drastically, in my opinion, which will put them in a bind because they won't be able to replace those officers they're losing to attrition. So the methodology I used in my research, I used qualitative research to review various research articles about Generation Z. So we look at conclusions showing implications on 21st century workforce. Generation Z's main workplace motivation is passion for their career. Unlike other generations, they have to have passion. They don't have the other drive as far as doing it for the company. They're doing it for passion and purpose. Happiness in the workplace is very key. Generation Z, work-life balance is also extremely important for this generation. The ability to be developed is important to Generation Z. And also it's key to know that Generation Z employees have a different style of communication based on the uniqueness of their generation. Generation Z employees bring their own personal skills, viewpoints, and motivational factors and life experience. If we look at our recommendations, to successfully manage and lead Generation Z officers, law enforcement managers must do the following. And like I mentioned earlier, this will increase, in my opinion, the retention rate of Generation Z officers and recruiting. First, fully educate themselves on the workplace characteristics of Generation Z. They should build individual connections and rapport with their Generation Z officers. They should allow Generation Z officers to have input on the best way that they want to be managed and to lead them. This can be done with having targeted surveys. They should be flexible in how they manage and lead Generation Z officers. They should leverage new technology, virtual and interactive training. They should facilitate multi-generational relationships building throughout the organization. They should find creative ways to keep Generation Z officers engaged. And they should provide avenues for career development. These are a look at the references I used throughout this research. So in conclusion, C is very important, in my opinion, as we enter into this new era of law enforcement, where recruiting and retaining officers is starting to become an issue nationwide. Law enforcement managers and leaders must be dialed in to Generation Z. They have to be flexible and must be willing to change the way they do business in the workplace, where they communicate, how they get feedback, the technology they use, and also your work options that they have within the organization to be successful. So thank you all for your attention during this presentation. I'm open to any and all feedback. Thank you.